Give everyone a couple minutes to take a seat. I hope all of you have had a chance to have some food and get a drink. Good evening. Thank you all for coming. Wow, what a turnout. Wonderful. My name is Pazine Ahmed. Those of you who don't know me, I'm the president of the Montgomery County Women's Democratic Club. We are a membership organization of politically active women and men working to advance Democratic policy priorities and to elect Democrats up and down the ballot. We work to educate all voters at the local, state, and federal, national issues of importance to Democrats, with a special focus on issues that disproportionately affect women and their families. If you're a member, thank you. Please give a hand of applause to all the members in the room. And if you're not a member, maybe consider joining. We have a membership table. Enid is our membership chair. I know she's in recruiting since we got here. So you can sign up there with Enid, or you can go online at womensdemocratic.club.org and you can sign up for a membership there. So at WDC, we continue to bring you events, including presentations, community dialogues, advocacy efforts, and much more throughout the year. And to make these events accessible, we do these at no cost to people attending. And the only way we can continue to do this is to be able to, with your help. So if you are a member, just remember to renew your membership annually. If you're able to make a donation in addition to that, we'd love to have that for you. But we also want you to join by volunteering your time, by attending our events, by engaging in our advocacy, and sharing information about our work to amplify important issues and voices to bring democratic values to our community now and in the future. So a little bit about upcoming events. On April 28th, from 2:30 p.m. to 5, that's a Sunday, we'll have a CD6 Democratic Candidate Forum at Central Valley High School. This will be a great opportunity to hear directly from the candidates on the issues, on key issues. So please take advantage of that. We have Brian Karam, who's going to be hosting that. And for those of you who do not know Brian for 11 years was the editor of the Montgomery County Sentinel. And he was also a White House correspondent and as Salad.com. Right now he has his own podcast. So you can register on the website and you'll have the opportunity, if you do it in time, to send in a question. On May 13th at noon, we'll be holding our biannual Tommy Raskin Memorial Speaker Series via Zoom. As you probably know, Tommy was Sarah and Jamie's beloved son. His too short life inspired WDC in consultation with the Raskin family to start a memorial speaker series to honor Tommy in 2022. Tommy was a precociously compassionate person who motivated many of us with his final request that we look after each other, the animals, and the global poor. This year's speaker will be Robin Neidert, president of the Women's Microfinance Initiative, which promotes women's economic participation and carries hope of prosperity to rural areas of Uganda, Kenya, and Tanzania. Join us to learn how Robin and the Women's Microfinance Initiative put Tommy's values into action by using micro-lending to dramatically increase women's incomes, resulting in greater economic security, food security for women and their families, as well as educational opportunities for their children. On May 22nd, we'll have a panel on maternal health, and you'll see much more about that in our next newsletter and on our website. So before we get started, I want to thank the entire WDC board and our team of volunteers for helping put this event together. Could all the board members stand up, please? And also the volunteers that helped with this event that are not necessarily on the board. We have plenty of those too, so please, everyone volunteering. I think that we need to definitely stand up. So let's take a quick moment to recognize the elected officials here. We have, first I want to recognize Omar Lasso. Omar, where are you? So this is Omar's restaurant that we're all at, and thank you so much for hosting this event. And Omar is also the president of the Montgomery County Latino Democratic Club. He wears many hats. Then we have Delegate Emily Shetty, Council Member Natalie Fanny Gonzalez is here. President of the Board of the Montgomery County Board of Elections, David Naiman is here. Did I miss any? Oh. You're serving on behalf of Delegate Jared Song. I'm the president of Cuba Good, which is doing some amazing work.
In my personal capacity.
Did I miss it? I didn't think I missed some people, but anyone else that I missed? Okay, and now it is my very distinct honor to introduce Sarah Bloom Raskin. We haven't Sarah is a partner at Kaya Partners Limited, a climate advisory firm based in London and Copenhagen. She's also the Colin W. Brown Distinguished Professor of the Practice at Duke Law School, where she teaches climate change and financial markets and law and financial anxiety, as well as corporate law. Sarah has served both as Deputy Secretary of the U.S. Department of Treasury and as a governor for the Federal Reserve. As the second in command of the U.S. Treasury, she oversaw the entire Treasury Department. She's known for her pursuit of innovative, equitable solutions to economic challenges, as well as for the focus on the resilience of the country's critical financial infrastructure. Earlier, Sarah was governor of the Federal Reserve Board and a member of the Federal Open Market Committee, where she helped conduct the nation's monetary policy to promote financial stability. She focused both on the macro performance of the economy in light of the widening heterogeneity of income and wealth, and on the micro contours of economic insecurity in households and communities. She has also served as commissioner for the financial regulation of the state of Maryland from 2007 to 2010. She and her agency were responsible for regulating Maryland's financial institutions during the height of the Great Recession. Sarah's public-facing work focuses on economic resilience. She has a deep understanding of the origination and management of systemic risks from diverse sources, such as financial instruments, supply chains, pandemics, climate events, as well as their distributional and equitable impacts. She is a leading voice in understanding climate change as it pertains to the economy. Her courage was evident when she stood for confirmation to return to the Federal Reserve Board in the face of concerted attacks by American Petroleum Institute and their Senate allies, opposing the nomination of persons who examine climate change's role in the economy. Her current work internationally, nationally, regionally, and at the state level focuses on creating a climate-resilient economy and illuminating the contours of the decarbonization transition. She was recently named co-chair by the United States Framework Constitution on climate change to examine the recognition and accountability of net zero pledges by the private sector. She received her BA in economics from Amherst College and her JD from Harvard Law School. Welcome, Sarah. Well, we needed to put all of that in there. It's U.S. conversation, I want everyone there to know. So it's such an honor for us to have you join to celebrate Earth Day and talk about climate change, the environment, net zero in the context of economic policies, financial regulators, and the financial markets. So you've been a leading voice in highlighting that economic and financial stability risks are tied to climate change. In one published column, you wrote that financial regulators must reimagine their own role so they could play their part in the broader imagining of the economy. So most people don't automatically associate financial regulation, financial markets, and climate change. Can you talk about how climate regulation is an important tool to mitigate climate change and climate risk?
Sure, and I will start by saying I'm just so happy to be here. I mean, it's really, this is quite a place. Oh my, what a restaurant, wow. So, we're really much looking forward to the conversation. And I guess to break it down, what I've really been focused on is how the economy and how households, businesses are going to move through climate change, right? Because climate is affecting the way we live. Even if we don't necessarily notice one day that we've woken up and our basement is flooded, or the roof is leaking, or there's been a hurricane with hailstones that have wrecked our windows. What is in fact happening is that the planet is warming, and it is warming at an accelerated pace that is actually breaking down different part of our nature systems, our weather events, and wreaking havoc of all sorts. And I'm not I didn't come to this work through through an environmental lens or even really a conservation lens. The work I have done historically focuses on resilience. So this notion of economic resilience, when businesses, when communities, when cities are knocked down, how do they get back up? That's this notion of bounce back, of resilience. Like, what happens when there's a shock to a system? What does it mean to stand it back up? And that's really been the theme of my work. And it was only really post-COVID that I started to think about this notion that, we certainly saw what the pandemic did to the economy, what it did to businesses, what it did to communities, to employment, to the whole host of things. And at least in my lifetime, there have been two major economic shocks like this, like COVID, and prior to that, the financial crisis. And in both of these instances, there was massive dislocation. I mean, people lost jobs, people lost homes. I mean, we don't like to dwell on it, but there were significant costs associated with these events. And so this notion of how you build back, how you step back into performance of your business or your household, or how you get back on course is one that's just always been interesting to me. And so this notion of resilience plays very well into figuring out how we're going to react as we move through climate change. And it has both, I think, an intellectual component and a personal component because, I think about resilience of us in households and in businesses and communities and really the economy writ large. But there's also, at least for me, this notion of personal resilience. Like, how do you actually step back after a significant setback? And we've all had them, and we've also, significant loss. And what do you imagine you will do to kind of move things forward in a way that will have maximum impact? And clearly the notion of resilience and bouncing back was one that had always interested me from an economic and intellectual perspective, but it hit me also personally. And so, when we lost Tommy, it was a sense of, what can you do? What am I going to do with my time creating here? And we know that life can be short. How do you essentially orient yourself for maximum impact? So the work of climate change and how it affects the economy has been one that is exceedingly challenging. Okay, I mean, by the way, if it were an easy problem, it would be fixed. Okay, and it isn't fixed at all. It is far from fixed. It's I would say become really hard because it's become politicized, and we can talk about how an issue like climate change could be something that is a political issue where people differ. Of course, science is supposed to be science, and why there would be political debate is, an interesting topic. But it's really that, Tazeen, how I kind of came to wanting to understand what happens when the ways in which the economy work have been hit down. They've been hit down because the waterways, for example, that have to transport things are more shallow. So barges that are carrying components from one place to another can't do it as quickly. Or when the Amazon truck can't get to your house because a tree has fallen, and the tree has fallen because there's essentially been a storm that nobody predicted. So we have these events that are now affecting the economy, that are affecting our cost of living. I think inflation is in large part driven by the fact that we've had these supply chain problems. So I think this is a really challenging piece of work, and that's really how I came.
So you've mentioned the financial crisis and the pandemic, and how, so one of the things I think we all saw in both of those cases was there was a really unequal impact that those crises had on the various communities and society as a whole, right? So do you see parallel patterns emerging with climate change? Are there certain communities that are disproportionately bearing the cost of climate change? And how do we address those inequities?
Absolutely. So this is an issue, yet another issue that has unequal impact, right? So we are now understanding that communities of color, low and moderate income, neighborhoods that have been potentially located near toxic waste sites, there is disparate impact. So we have yet another set of issues where the impacts are not evenly spread. We see that in our state. We see that across states. So we see it in the country, and we also see it across countries. So now we're also being exposed to the notion that of course, climate change is not just a Maryland issue. It's not even just a national issue because climate change has no borders. Greenhouse gas emissions are being, are climbing in all parts of the world. And there are some countries that actually are bearing heavy costs. And there are island countries with that are literally underwater. And these countries have huge amounts of debt, and they also have huge climate impacts, and they are also not emitters. So you have this notion of inequity that is not just in communities that we might know about, but are also across countries, across the world. So a lot of the debates going on regarding how to pay for the costs of climate change first of all, they're happening, a lot of them happen at the United Nations in an international context, but there's discussions about who should pay. Who should pay for these costs that are often being borne by families, households, communities in countries that had nothing to do with them. So these are real challenges that have been moved and are debated actually in an international context as well.
So last year you were named co-chair of the United States Framework Convention on Climate Change. United Nations, yes.
Yeah.
United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change to examine the recognition and accountability of net zero pledges by the private sector. And we keep hearing about net zero in the context of, even the counties have this idea they want to be at net zero by a certain year. Could you talk about, explain what actually net zero really means and why it's important?
Sure. So this notion of net zero is the idea that by a certain year, and when you talk about net zero, it's always attached to a year. Okay, so by a certain year, if you are net zero, it means that the amount of your emissions equals the amount that you're taking back in CO2 and other emissions. So you're in balance. If you are at net zero, the net of your pushing out the emissions and the subtracting them what you pull back in is zero. So this concept of net zero has taken hold as a way in which municipalities, countries, businesses, firms can aim towards getting to a place where they are in balance, right? Where the emissions equal the reductions, and that's that would be probably not so hard if we had a way of getting the CO2 out. But right now we don't have big ways of getting CO2 out. You can plant more trees, but that in no way is matching the amount of emissions. So the idea of net zero by a certain year is that can we imagine a municipality, a state, a company being able to be in balance by a certain year where its emissions are not exceeding in any way what they are able to pull back. Now, if we can get to a technological innovation, like some kind of silver bullet that will magically pull CO2 back, we will actually have this solved. But as of now, we don't have that, and can't necessarily plan on it because it will be much too late. So as of now, the focus is on how do you reduce the amount of emissions to get to net zero. A lot of the net zero pledges are 2050, so a lot of that's kind of the year that you hear. You hear that if you can be net zero by 2050, that would mean by 2040 you would possibly have done, maybe 80%. You're like 80% of the way there. So you back it up. You have a plan where you try to figure out how can we actually get to net zero by this particular date. So that's the meaning.
Thank you. So I think most of us in this room agree that climate change is a problem and that we need a multifaceted, multi-level approach to solve it. But there are many lawmakers who don't believe in climate change. So how can we advance agendas regarding climate change when you have so many elected officials that are deniers that don't believe it exists?
Yeah, it's a real problem to actually try to have a conversation with a climate denier. But I think one thing that we can do as citizens is that when we vote, I think we want to vote for people who understand that there's cost. There's cost to climate change, okay? And it doesn't mean that you have to find people who know exactly what the solutions are, or people who can say, oh yeah, I think this, we can easily fix this. Just people who are aware, who can figure out, who actually are not denying it. And I want to say, one of the things I've learned in this United Nations work is that the United States is actually lagging. I mean, there are other countries that kind of get it, where you don't have the level of denialism that we have here. The denialism, I think the way you fight it is through voting. You vote for people who understand that climate change has costs. And if you can get a recognition that climate change has costs, then I think you're electing somebody who can be committed to trying to figure out how to reduce those costs.
Yes, so we all need to vote, I think we know that. We have a room full of voters, but we need to vote in a certain way. So your views on climate change played a central role, your views on climate change should play a central role in economic policy and financial oversight, earned you a powerful opposition from the fossil fuel industry during the Senate confirmation hearings for the top regulatory spot at the Federal Reserve. Can you talk about that experience and the potential consequences for future potential nominees that advocate for climate change publicly? Will this make people more cautious about openly expressing views on this?
Okay, so sure. So I, after having been a governor on the Fed and deputy secretary of the Treasury, the commissioner of financial regulation in Maryland, when this administration, I did that mostly under the Obama administration. When this new administration, the Biden administration, they said, would you think about going back to the Fed? But this time focus on regulation as well as doing monetary policy, so being the vice chair. And at first I was like, well, I had done it before, we had suffered this horrible loss. I wasn't exactly in the mood for it. But the White House was persistent, and they, I asked them to look for other people. There's a lot of other people in the country, who could do it. I had been at the Fed before, didn't need to go back. But anyway, reluctantly did agree. But I said, I do have a record here of actually talking about the effect of climate change on the economy. And this is, it sounds kind of pretty obvious, like this, that there's a linkage, but nobody before had really done that, who had actually said, should we think about climate change actually as maybe affecting price levels? Should we think about it when we try to figure out how productive people can be in heat, when there's extensive heat? So to me, there were obvious linkages between climate change and the economy, and I wanted to make that clear, and I had written about it and spoken about it, and wanted that known. Okay, so that was that and the White House obviously was fine with all of that, but not everybody was okay with all of that. It turns out that the American Petroleum Institute was not okay with that at all, and in particular, got a little, got threatened in a way that, we've never seen before. So again, I had gone through a Fed confirmation before, and usually the groups that will weigh in favor or not in favor of you are the banks or the financial institutions. They're the ones that essentially care really about who's at the Fed. But with my nomination, there was a new group that was interested all of a sudden and wanted to, and cared about who was at the Fed, and that was essentially the large oil and gas companies. They did not want somebody at the Fed who was going to kind of think about energy or the energy transition or the effects of alternative energies on how the economy is going to operate. So what they did was they actually worked with particular dark money channels and got set up a group called it's one of these phony groups, and Jane Mayer wrote about it extensively, actually, in the New Yorker. This group, I think, Americans for Accountability. I think that was what it was called. And they channeled money into this group that was meant to target Biden nominees who were women and people of color who might be saying something that was uncomfortable for others, I guess. And so they had targeted me. So I was on this website as a person who needed to be defeated. And then this group actually worked with a group of Republican senators who very much did not, want to challenge anything that the fossil fuel industry was saying. So there was a concerted, it turned out to be a really kind of interesting story that Jane Mayer kind of unraveled here, because this group called itself a 501c3, but they were definitely lobbying to keep particular viewpoints out of the Fed and other agencies. So it was really quite something. And yeah, I hadn't said anything that I thought was particularly outrageous, but it had a consequence, and not just on me. I was fine with it. In fact, it empowered me actually to keep talking because I realized that we really did need to understand this linkage between the economy and climate. But unfortunately, it had a sort of a chilling effect on people wanting and needing to speak out about things happening to the economy. I mean, that's really the role of what you look at the Fed, and whether or not you like what you see in terms of some of these events, it seems to me you have to talk about them. And now nobody talks about it. Nobody talks about, I mean, they do not. If you want a job to be nominated, you will not mention climate change. And that is unfortunate. That is really unfortunate. So I think it's had a little bit of that effect. I was actually in Dubai talking about at the United Nations meetings in December, and somebody who had just been nominated to do another financial role after me, she said, Sarah, after what you went through, like, nobody talks about climate. We don't dare mention it. So that's unfortunate, and I'm hoping, we can figure out a way to kind of embolden people to be able to talk about what matters. That should be the richness of our country. You've got to bring these issues. And by the way, I haven't done any significant work to quantify the effects. I'm not saying that these are massive effects. I'm not saying that, our price levels are significantly higher because of climate. I'm not saying that. I'm just saying, ask the questions. Can we ask the questions? Can we start there to just ask them? And I think the importance of inquiry can't be overstated here.
Well, I know that was not the greatest experience you went through, so sorry that you had to experience that. So I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to open it up to the audience. So if you guys have questions, we'll take some of them before we adjourn. So one of the big questions I was going to ask you is, what advice would you give someone who's interested? I mean, I know we talked about voting, and I think that's a given, right? But what advice would you give someone interested in transforming the financial sector into a greener one? What things can we do that have an impact either as consumers or as experts in various fields? So we have a lot of people from a wide variety of backgrounds that are working on the inside. How can we make a difference?
It's a great question. There's so much that people can do as they continue their lives. Like, you don't have to, sort of turn your life upside down in order to, create a more sustainable living space. One of the challenges, and this is coming, I'm sorry, from the fossil fuel industry, is that we we as consumers are not given the choices we need to easily convert into other energy forms. So for example, if many people want solar panels, many people want to just, electrify their homes, and sometimes it's not easy, and we're getting obstacles in terms of just wanting to, and by the way, these are cheaper options too. We can do this and have our utility bills go down, and we're getting obstacles in place in our ways. So I think I would never say to any household like, oh, just so easy, just go get yourself some solar panels and you'll lower your monthly bills. I would never do that. I would never preach in that way because it's hard. Our systems are not enabled for choice. And I think that that's one of the things, it's, obviously different in our beloved county. We've got ways, thank you, of elected officials for helping on that. But we do need more. And I think in terms of just our homes, I think creating healthier living spaces for us at home is to move towards electrification. Because when you power with electricity, you can get these green electrons that are actually not coming from extractive fossil fuel methods. But we need to be able to, it's got to be easy. It's got to be easy before we are able to do this conversion. So I think that's one of the things we can aim to do. And we're just working on it in our house now. I mean, we are not, we can't do solar panels because we have too many trees. We're not going to cut down the trees because we need them to actually, pull out our CO2. But there are particular utility companies that can create these community sort of solar farms. And so when you've seen these kind of big areas where there's huge fields with solar panels, that's producing good solar cheap energy. And there are utilities now that can channel that energy to our homes. And that's good if you can make that happen. And then of course, our appliances, when we need to upgrade or something is broken, I always say try to go electric if you can.
Thank you. So I see the first person.
Yeah, we have to stand up. It has to be short.
Okay, great to have you here and to hear you talk. I'm wondering, you talk about the costs of climate change, and I don't know whether the Democratic Party or President Biden has talked about this, or if it's politically good for him to do this, but there are real costs. I mean, people down in Florida, many of them can't afford home insurance anymore. People in California can't afford insurance anymore. Insurance companies are really troubled by this. Can we get some support from them and start talking about real costs to real people? And would that be a positive for Biden's campaign?
I think so. You put your finger on an issue that's happening right now. It has not happened in Maryland yet, but in California and in Florida, insurance companies are leaving. They're just saying, we're out of here. And part of it is because they can't insure, it's too costly to insure against all these climate events. And so essentially they're saying, we are going to raise the premiums 5 times in order to pay for all these climate events, or we're going to leave the state. And what's happening certainly in California and Florida, and it's starting to happen in other states, is that the insurance commissioners are saying you can't pass on premiums like that to households. It's unaffordable. So the insurance companies are saying, okay, if you're not going to let us charge those premiums, which is what we need to recoup the costs that the climate is costing us, we're out of here. And if they're out of here, then what happens is that people can't buy houses. Or you're not going to get a mortgage if you don't have insurance. And to be able to get a bank or a lender to give you a mortgage, you need to be able to show that you've got insurance. If there's no insurance company in your state, that will cover you, you're not gonna be able to buy a house. So this is one of the linkages, this is one of the ways in which what's happening in one market moves into another market, and it's in our home, I mean, it's part of our everyday life now. So I happen to think this is a really good political issue to be discussing right now, and whether or not it is or not, but it's being experienced. And there's another interesting dimension to it while we're talking about insurance, which is if there's no insurance in your state, because the insurance companies have left, most states have a kind of a state-run insurance fund. Those funds are gonna get maxed out, they're gonna get depleted if there's no other insurance. And who do you think pays for that? We all do. That will just move right into our tax bills. So, and that's just not the way to be dealing with this. There have to be ways, I think, that are just smarter than waiting for these consequences to roll through. But it's a really good point.
I'm gonna take the priority of saying we just put an announcement for next time on there. We're gonna pass around papers for people to put questions on for our next event. Now back to Sarah and Raskin.
Yeah, hi. Appreciated comments so far. So two-part. Is it correct that the climate, in a sense, is deteriorating at a faster rate than it has stayed? And second of all, what are some of the things that we can do that will be most effective in moving us in a better direction?
First of all, that is what's happening. Climate events are happening at a faster rate and not a predictable rate. So even the models that are used to predict these events are looking wrong, because the events are happening more frequently, they're happening with more ferocity, so stronger, and they're interacting, so we're seeing now the systems interact. So you've got like heat affecting both wildfires, affecting sea level rise and flooding. So you now are seeing and I'm not a climate scientist, but this is what we're seeing. The events are linked. And that was and when they're linked, you have greater damage and greater cost. So, and the problem is you can't predict, you can't say with certainty how these events are gonna unfold, but the climate scientists are saying that they're seeing them unfold at a faster rate with greater ferocity, greater interconnection to other systems, and much greater cost than they predicted.
The second part about what are the directions that are most productive going forward right now?
We're gonna keep moving,
Sorry, Tony.
Afterwards,
So you mentioned the petroleum industry coming up with their mock group of Americans for Accountability or whatever. And then we have all of these companies that are the worst offenders that actually have a sector of your company that does environmentally good things to show what good actors they are. And this is known as greenwashing. On the one hand, they're trying to do good things to counteract with the bad things they're doing, but on the other hand, it's about their image. What do you think of greenwashing?
well, greenwashing, Jill, is a real thing. It is really happening. Now, one of the good things is, about net zero is that firms, companies, municipalities are trying to work towards net zero. That's a good thing. At the same time, it's gotta mean something. It can't just be what Jill calls greenwashing, which is essentially saying you're doing things that you don't really do, or that if you were to analyze are not doing anything. You kind of do it to burnish your image, but it's kind of nothing burger. So that's the greenwashing challenge. And it is real, and it means, I think, that we need to create accountability for these commitments, for these pledges on net zero. So I think it's terrific when firms say, we're gonna be net zero by a certain year, but it has to be backed up by something. It has to be backed up by real action, and citizens need to be able to understand how they are working towards net zero. What does it mean if you're gonna be net zero in 2050? What does that look like for us in, 2024, in 2034, in 2044? How essentially are we gonna move towards this net zero piece by that year?
Hi, thank you for taking our questions. I've been a science journalist for almost 50 years, so I've been covering climate for 30. And the one thing that's clear, covering chemistry and physics of climate, is that nobody wants to hear about it. What they do, and a lot of people just say they don't believe it, but what they do believe are the numbers. And so it seems to me that your argument, the finance, is where it's really at. When my dad was arguing against it, I said, it's gonna cost you again, what are you gonna do about it? And then he started to listen. And I think for all the people who are not listening to the great climate science that's out there, you tell them how much it's gonna cost them. You get the banks to tell them. You get those insurance companies to tell them, yeah, we're not gonna finance you, and your state's gonna go bankrupt if you're the insurer of last resort. People will listen to the numbers because they're not listening to me. And after 30 years, it's so depressing. I think they'll listen to you, they won't listen to me. So my pitch to the banks, insurers, and others to make a good costing of these costs. And the other thing is you also talked earlier about how you saw a couple of big shocks that really changed. I don't see this as a shock. This is sort of a frog in a, pot of water and stuff. What we see now is as good as it's ever going to get. It's not a shock. It's the beginning of a really bad trend that is never going to get better. So it's not a shock. You can't get resilient. You've got to figure, what are we going to do to live with it? Not recover, but live with it. And again, it's going to cost a whole lot of money.
Right.
So make that,
You do that for me.
Can you get
But there is, I think there is a really good point on the fact that it doesn't manifest as a shock. And this goes to kind of what I think about like resilient, we kind of just adapt and we don't realize we're adapting, right? Things are actually moving in a hotter direction and we are just adapting. We are changing, we're making sure our air conditioning system is working, our bills are going. Which is part of the problem. But the problem, so one of the challenges though is that our regulatory system responds after shocks, right? It waits for a shock. Like think of the pandemic. We kind of have the pandemic, and then you got like the CARES Act, or PPP, and it comes after. The financial crisis, subprime mortgages tipped over the economy, and then you have this massive change. We don't respond in a proactive way to many problems, certainly not climate, and yet it demands it for exactly the reason you're describing. It's not going to manifest itself in probably not in one huge event. It's this it's boiling the frog, right? I mean, it's getting hotter and hotter, and things are happening gradually. That we're every so often we get big events with big costs, but how policy should orient itself around a challenge like that is something that we haven't. And I don't know what the analogs are there, but that's also part of the challenge.
The actuaries with the reinsurance companies have been looking at this for 20 years. I mean, why aren't people listening to them? The actuary should be making your case for you and then for
Let's keep moving. Sorry, can you do one more?
Okay, I have a quick commercial break. Because we have you in the room, our next event is the D6 Forum, Candidates Forum, and we're looking for really good questions to ask at the forum. So we can all multitask. We have our last question right here from Jessica, and we gave you some paper and some pens and pencils. Any questions you might have?
So sign up. Do that really, Lisa. I'm really afraid to be the last question on kind of a deeper note, and I really am not trying to be. But as we're talking around here about the events becoming fiercer and more active and piling on each other, and I'm thinking about my life from right now, halfway between 2000 and 2050, right? Just the difference between 2000 and 2024, how, is net zero 2050 enough, I guess?
And remember how I defined it, remember the definition of net zero, that just is, it's a point in time. In 2050, you will be poised in equal balance, but that doesn't do anything for the emissions that have been accumulating, that have come out since, up to that point. So we do need it. That is one tool. Net zero is one tool. And don't think you can pledge net zero and we've got this solved. It is one tool only. But don't be a doomer. Don't be a doomer.
I promise I'm not.
Okay, because let me tell you, we can end on this. Emissions are continuing to climb. That is true. But the curve is flattening. It is flattening. Yes, it's still an upward slope, but it is flattening. And that is, I think, due to a lot of extraordinary action. I should also say, like, the regions, this is where it's gonna happen. It's gonna be actions of communities, regions, piloting new ideas, being able to imagine why life is gonna be better when we can breathe clean and, clean air and feel better. We're gonna get that locally. That's where it's gonna start. So I hope that keeps you
So
going.
I just have one more gentleman who's had his hand up from the beginning.
Last year was the hottest year in the history of the world. And my question, which is, it's not simple, but have we really solved this? You've explained to all the people who are doing the oil industries. Every week you read about a new reserve that they're finding and arguing with the Brazilians that drilled it. And there's no serious interest on the part of major factors in the world economy in many ways to do anything about this. So kind of a simple but crude question is, are we lost?
I don't think we're lost at all. When you poll people want climate solutions. I mean, that just is one of these extraordinary prevailing senses. And there's a lot of really good things happening. And yes, it is hard. If it were not hard, it would have been solved by now. It's extraordinarily hard. I don't think it's impossible. I think we are capable of figuring this out, and it's going to take work at the local level, at the state level, at the regional level, national level, international. There's major work going on all of those levels, and if you would be impressed if you saw it. It's very hard, and it has to happen with speed, because of course this isn't a kind of luxury item anymore to kind of get the kind of air we like to breathe. There's an urgency to it, so. But I think good things are gonna happen.
Good luck to you.
What a great conversation, a great event. Thank you. Thank you for all the work you do and for supporting, all of the things you're continuing to do this amazing work. And please help yourself to the food. Remember, it is up front. If you want to sign up for a membership, you get to attend great events like this. And look forward to seeing you on the 28th. Good night, everyone.